Slavery is a tradition, practiced since the first civilizations. Our world has been built upon the enslavement of our fellow man. The sweat of his brow, his blood, is the cornerstone of our society. Oppression inspires hope, suffering, faith. Both freemen and slaves held on to this innate belief, this absolute trust in the divine covenant between God and man. Christianity emerged preaching principles of equality, commanding, demanding, that man right the wrongs he committed in absolute sin. For a time, this call was ignored. Man turned a deaf ear to his Creator. Slowly, humanity recognized this voice and began the slow journey towards equality. It began with a recognition that slavery is immoral. It began with a law that it was illegal to enslave fellow Christians. Though this is not the complete equality preached by Christianity, it is a step in the right direction. Slaves soon began to acquire basic rights, such as the right to marry. In the midst of introduction of these newfound freedoms, church leaders began to speak up. They had come to use their position in the church to elevate the position of slaves by suggesting ideas. One such idea was that manumitting slaves hastened one's soul on the path to salvation. By preaching in the favor of slaves, these leaders had brought up the issue of the inhumane treatment of fellow man. They had sounded the drums, awakened man to his mistakes, his crimes. The morals and values imposed by Christianity had brought about a new era, an age of fairness and equality. Though a slow one, the journey to freedom would soon be at a close, and the people we had come to see as livestock would be granted their humanity, for God had kept his covenant.
Slavery has been practiced since the first human civilizations, forcing subjugation from other people. In the early modern era, the increase of technological innovation increased the demand for slaves for the production of goods. But the rise of innovation wasn't the only thing that found a place in the early modern era. At the same time that innovation and the corresponding rise of the demand for slaves were taking place, the emphasis of religion and faith were also gaining more influence. But when one considers these conflicting trends, the question arises of how, among people who claim to be so devoted to a faith that shunned violence and promoted the liberation of people from sin and equality under the eyes of God, could the increase of slavery be tolerated and nonetheless supported? How is it that the Christian faith and the enslavement of fellow men could have found a place together within civilization, coexist peacefully, and even support one another? The answer lies not within the values and practices of Christianity, but more so in the corruption of its practitioners. At the time that Christianity was finding widespread followers within Western Europe, the church and state were two closely intertwined institutions. The availability of biblical texts and literacy among people weren't high at the time, leaving most, if not all, common people to rely on their church and its leaders to guide them in their faith. However, in the fight for dominance, the rivaling states of Western Europe took advantage of any opportunity to get ahead. With the increase of technological innovation, each state within Western Europe was fighting to be the leader in world trade, which called for the increase of production of goods and, in turn, the slave labor that was cheap and highly profitable to these states. How could something so unjust and inhumane be overlooked by states rooted within the Christian faith? In order to receive the support of the people, political leaders that had the power and ability could persuade the church to manipulate people to their advantage. In this instance, that happened to be persuading the people through their blind trust in their faith that slavery was justifiable. Whether the enslaved were heretics that needed to be punished, or hopeless people that needed to be under European rule in order to civilize them and introduce them to the proper faith. Church and state always found some reason to justify the oppression of other humans. The people of these states looked to their faith for comfort and answers, and consequently fell under the influence of a corrupted state and church as a result of their innocent devotion. The corruption of the church is even revealed in Dante's 14th century epic poem, The Inferno. And from this corruption, the justification and coercion of people to support the practice of slavery led to years of abuse, oppression, and racism. The increase of innovation during that time period provided motivation for the powers of the state to manipulate people's faith for their personal gain. The influence of the church, the added luxuries, and free labor were enough to convince people that slavery was okay, right even. People who relied on religious leaders to guide them were convinced of the forced servitude of others deemed lesser than them. These people were under the mercy of their church and state, with hardly any opportunity to interpret religious texts for themselves. Therefore, the atrocities and inhumanity of this period that supported slavery cannot be wholly laid upon the shoulders of the people of this time, but on the ignorance they were forced to live under, and the corruption of the people who had the power to change it. The foundation of what allowed Christian people to tolerate slavery is not within the ideals of a corrupt faith, but within the corrupted hearts and minds of the people who had the knowledge and the power to manipulate people's faith for their own desire.